and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back, everybody. Your host, Michael. On a Wednesday evening, we're discussing demonology, especially from the Eastern Catholic perspective, with none other than Father Deacon Anthony Dragani joining us once again. Father Deacon, how are you?
Fantastic. How are you doing, Michael?
Doing good. Always good to have you on.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah. You know, it's really interesting hearing from the Eastern Catholic perspective. I love hearing from it, and I know the audience does as well. So I'm excited about this one. Like I said, we're discussing demonology, and it kind of came out of our last discussion where we were just discussing cults and some of the dangers with them. And we had to eventually get into the topic of spiritual warfare and some of the problems with the demonic. And that's what kind of led to this. But we're going to be a little bit more broad with the discussion. Doesn't have to be limited to the dangers of the occult and demonology there, but just more demonology in general, considered from an Eastern Catholic perspective. So what I'm going to do is just hand it over to you to take it wherever you want to go, and I'll interact with you as you go through.
Sounds great. So here's the main thing to understand. In the Eastern Christian theological tradition, the spiritual world is a battleground, and our lives really are taking place in the middle of this battleground. There's a war going on all the time between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and we're all surrounded by these spiritual entities that are influencing us one way or the other. So if you look at the writings of the Eastern Fathers, they talk a lot about demons and demonic attacks, but they primarily look at how they influence us as human beings. And the belief is that the demons, the fallen angels, these were angels who were made to serve God. They were in some capacity involved in the creation of the world. They were meant to help oversee the world, but a group of them chose to rebel against God. And they chose to rebel because they did not want to serve, to help human beings to become godlike. What upset them was the idea of theosis, of human beings becoming like God, ultimately us becoming greater than them. So a number of them chose to rebel. And the belief is that these fallen angels, these demons, influence our thoughts. And their goal is to try and keep us from reaching theosis. Their goal is to keep us from growing more and more godlike. So to put it in a practical sense, the idea is that many times the thoughts that we have that lead us down a dark path, the thoughts that lead to bad decision-making, don't necessarily originate in our minds. More often than we realize, they originate from evil spirits, putting the thoughts into our minds so as to influence us down a dark direction. And the belief is that these thoughts come at us more often than we realize. And our task is to learn to keep what's called watchfulness, to prepare our minds so that when the thoughts come at them, we don't fall for them, we don't entertain them. However, if you get in the habit of giving in to these thoughts whenever they come, eventually we become weaker and weaker and less able to resist. And then what happens eventually is you develop what's called a passion. A modern term for that would be an addiction. And at that point, you're pretty much enslaved to the vice, whatever it is. And that's seen in the writings of the Eastern Fathers as a form of demonic possession. When you're enslaved to a passion, the demon has control over you and your free will is impaired. It's a type of demonic possession. So again, the goal is to develop watchfulness and discernment so that when the thoughts come at you, you're able to close the gate rather than letting them in and entertaining them.
How can you discern, if you can, whether or not this particular thought originates with a demon or is just coming from the flesh?
It's difficult to say with certainty. What is easier to discern, though, is if a thought is ultimately leading in the right direction or leading you away from God. There are different ways of doing that. The key thing is a thought that comes from demonic origin will ultimately lead to a state of agitation, a state of disunity of some kind. That's one of the telltale signs of demonic influence. Again, this is drawn from a number of Eastern fathers. Demonic thoughts and demonic influence always lead to agitation. A person who's being guided by demonic influence is incapable of expressing true joy. They're also incapable of expressing true peace. There's always an underlying agitation. And any movements that are fueled by demonic influence will always have agitation as the telltale sign. What I mean by that is they're not at peace, they're not content, they're always agitated and angry about something. And again, you find this belief in the writings of the fathers. One of the key tools of discernment is seeing, is there agitation behind this thought? Or does it lead to agitation? Is a movement leading to greater agitation and disunity? That's seen as a telltale sign. Now, again, it can be difficult to tell because sometimes the thoughts that the demons put in our minds appear to be positive. They appear to be good. They can appear to lead to good results. But again, that's them setting you up for something. That's them leading you down a path.
I've always heard that demons can't, they don't know what our thoughts are. They can't read our thoughts. Only God knows our thoughts. Yet you're saying that they can import certain thoughts into our minds. I wonder how those two are true. If they can import certain thoughts into our minds, you would think that they could know what we're thinking.
Mm-hmm. And just to backtrack a bit, I want to be clear that what I'm saying here comes primarily from the Eastern Fathers, and it seems crazy by today's standards. In our world, this is seen as crazy talk, right? Superstition. But that's from an Eastern perspective, that's one of the tools of the evil one, is to make us think that he does not exist. But getting back to your question specifically, so there's no definitive teaching on whether or not demons can read our thoughts. That being said, among the Eastern Fathers, there's a general consensus that they cannot. They cannot read our minds. They could influence our minds by placing thoughts inside them, but they cannot actually read our minds. And again, I'm not saying that's definitive, but that's a general consensus among most of the Eastern Fathers. That being said, they don't need to be able to read our minds because they're patient and they observe and they watch. They've been studying human behavior for thousands of years. And they've been studying us specifically throughout our lives, and they know us better than we know ourselves in many cases. So from watching us and observing us, they can pretty much tell what our thoughts are, and they can predict our actions with pretty remarkable accuracy, because humans are more predictable than we realize.
Can you tell us maybe about some of the other dangers that are involved? You're mentioning here that they can insert certain temptations into our thoughts. And so, of course, there's a danger to sin here. What are some other dangers that they could pose?
So yeah, like you said, the first is a danger to sin. And very often these are, more physical sins of the flesh type things, drug addiction, overeating, addiction to, sexuality, fornication, pornography. Those are, though, the most base of dangers. A greater danger would be the danger towards pride, the danger towards spiritual delusion. That's another one. So, for example, you may have a person who's become very good at resisting the temptations that lead to sins of the flesh. They may have developed a very strong gate, a sensor, so to speak, that shuts the gate whenever those thoughts arrive. But the demon then will change tactics and have this person think about how holy they are and how much they've grown spiritually, and make them feel more and more like they're close to God. And when that happens, that's setting them up then to actually go in the wrong direction. It's setting them up to turn their backs on God eventually through pride. One thing the demons hate more than anything is humility. They cannot stand humility. And again, I'm drawing from the Eastern Fathers, but they talk repeatedly about humility having the power to drive away demonic influence, along with fasting. Those are the two things they often come back to: humility and fasting, and of course, prayer. So they'll put thoughts of grandeur into a person's mind. Or they'll put thoughts of spiritual power into a person's mind. Demons will sometimes try and lead people into knowledge that's not accurate, so they can spawn heresies, so that they can lead people into spiritual arrogance. I remember reading a story about a saint who was growing in holiness, becoming a very devout monk, and then one day an angel appeared to him, a beautiful angel of light, who was going to lead him to the great mysteries of the faith. And this angel would appear every couple of days and give him lessons in theology. And the lessons were wonderful. I mean, they were solid theologically. They made a lot of sense. And he was learning so much. And every day, every so many days this would happen. He was looking forward to it. And then one day, as the angel was teaching him, the angel began to insert subtle errors here and there, very, very subtle, surrounded by great truth. And at a certain point, the monk realized, wait a minute, this is not from God. And he called out the angel and said, you're a fallen angel. And at that point, it was revealed that it was actually a demon trying to lead him into heresy. But he did so by making him think that he had spiritual powers, that he was chosen to deliver a message, that he was learning great truths. And he was learning a lot of truths. But again, the truths were setting him up for an error. Another thing a demon can do is make a person think they have supernatural abilities. Demons love to do things like make people think they have psychic powers. They can give you visions. They can give you the power to prophesy the future. And by the way, again, it's widely agreed among the Eastern Fathers, the demons don't know the future. They don't see the future, but they can predict it with some accuracy because they're so good at studying human behavior. And sometimes they can actually nudge things to happen in the future. They could tell you that somebody is going to die, and they could set up circumstances for their death, possibly. Again, you find fathers talking about this. But sometimes a person might think that they have visions or that they have psychic powers, when really it's a demon making them think that they're chosen for a special mission. It's a demon making them think they have psychic powers of some kind. In many ways, that's a greater danger, a much greater danger than being led into sins of the flesh.
You mentioned a person who might think that they're holy, but they're struggling with pride, in fact. Is this known as the sin of prelust? Or
Yes.
the danger, I should say, of prelust. Yeah.
That's the term you usually find. Yeah, prelust. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What all do the fathers say about this, about prelust?
They see it as one of the greatest dangers, because at that point, you're going down the wrong path, and you're convinced you're going down the path of holiness. And at that point, you're almost flying blind, so to speak. You've kind of lost your bearings. And when you've lost your bearings, it's easy to crash. It's easy to go in the wrong direction very rapidly. They see it as one of the greatest dangers.
And you're also talking there about, psychic abilities. So does that mean people who exemplify those kinds of abilities, they're receiving them from demons in all cases?
No, I don't think that in all cases it's demonic. I think in certain cases it may be. I think most cases of psychics are frauds, to be frank with you. I think the vast majority of them are very good at what's called cold reading. That's where they can predict things based upon a person's body language, based upon a person's speech patterns. They can discern things. I had a friend who was very good at cold reading. He'd go to parties and stuff and walk up to people and tell them their favorite color, tell them things about their lives that seemed very, very private, and they were amazed. They thought he had psychic powers. He was good at cold reading. He could read their body language and interpret things and make guesses. And he would tell them eventually. He was just playing with them. I think most psychics are doing that. But there might be people with actual psychic abilities that could be innate, something about the mind we don't understand. That is possible. But I think that in many cases, if a person really is exhibiting psychic powers, it could be demonic in origin, trying to lead them astray. It is definitely a possibility, but I wouldn't say it's always the case.
You talked there about demonic possession. Can you talk to us a little bit about that from the Eastern Catholic perspective?
Mm-hmm. Again, demonic possession, it's rare. It's seen as being very, very rare. And what's interesting is the Eastern Fathers, they did distinguish between mental illness and demonic possession. We often think, looking back, back in the day, people thought that the mentally ill were always possessed. That's not the case. The Eastern Fathers, going back to the early centuries of the church, knew the difference between the insane and the demonically possessed. They saw them as being two separate things. But typically, what leads to demonic possession is somebody opening themselves to influences. It usually happens voluntarily in the sense that you're opening yourself up to demonic influence. You may not realize you're being possessed, but you want something that you're getting out of the interaction, and that leads to an opening. But it's believed at the same time that if a person is full of grace, a demon cannot possess them. Again, you see many of the Eastern Fathers talking about that if the soul is full of grace, then at that point, a demon cannot enter in. Again, this isn't necessarily authoritative teaching, but this is a general perspective you find among the Fathers.
Is there exorcism in the Eastern Catholic tradition?
There is. And to be clear, when we're talking about the Eastern Catholic tradition, the Eastern Orthodox tradition is pretty much identical when it comes to these particular matters. We're drawing from the same fathers, from the same prayers. So the most commonly used exorcism is the one that takes place before baptism. A person is exorcised before they're baptized. Also, whenever we bless the holy water for theophany and whatnot, there's a type of exorcism that takes place over the water. But for a person who's demonically possessed, the prayer that would be used is the exorcism prayer of Saint Basil the Great. And it's a prayer that he wrote. It's not particularly long, but it's seen as having tremendous spiritual power. Now, this is something that's different. In Western Catholicism, exorcism is its own rite, so to speak. There's a whole rite of exorcism. It's very lengthy. It's a whole book you follow with a whole series of prayers. In the Eastern tradition, it's not quite as developed. There are certain prayers that are the go-tos, such as the prayer by Saint Basil the Great. But basically, it's about praying, it's about fasting, and it's about going through these prayers, but not in the same set order as you'd find in the West.
In the Eastern tradition, can non-clergy perform exorcisms?
So when you're conducting an exorcism, the most efficacious exorcism is done through the power of the church. So typically it's a clergyman, typically a priest, who's delegated by the bishop to do it. In the West, that's pretty regulated. In the Eastern tradition, in general, exorcism is limited to monastics. Typically, the only exorcists are monks. And that's for many reasons, one of which is that the diocesan clergy, so to speak, the secular clergy, are typically married with families. And being involved in exorcism is seen as being very, very, very dangerous. And it opens up your family to potential attack as well. So a married priest typically would not be an exorcist in the East. A married deacon would not be involved in exorcisms because you're opening your family up to a great danger. So typically the monks are the exorcists in the East. However, there are a number of cases of monks who were exorcists who were not necessarily ordained clergy. You could have a monk who's, a vowed monk who's not been ordained as a deacon or a priest, and they may possibly be performing exorcisms, not necessarily delegated by the bishop, but they're able to do it through their holiness and through their relationship with God. I read a whole book one time about a monk on Mount Athos who performed exorcisms, and he was a very powerful exorcist. He was not ordained as a deacon or a priest, but he had that ability. There were stories of many church fathers who were exorcists, who were monks, who were not priests or deacons or bishops. St. Anthony the Great was known to perform exorcisms, and he was never ordained to holy orders. That being said, I would not advocate anyone going out on their own and trying to do it.
Sure. What are the different indicators or indications that an exorcism might be needed on a person?
Okay, so in the Eastern tradition, the main thing they look for is how a person reacts in the presence of holy items, especially if those items are hidden. So, I remember reading stories about cases where if they suspected a person of possession, they'd have that person lay down flat, their face facing downward so they can't see anything, and then somebody would come up behind them and put an item on their back, like a gospel book or a blessed candle. And if they reacted in a certain way, they had a pretty good indication that there was possession. But the key thing is, if they react with horror or dread in the presence of the holy, especially if they're not visibly aware that the holy is there, that's usually seen as one of the main indicators.
So knowledge of hidden things, in the Western tradition, there's also, knowledge of particular languages and things like
Right.
that. Are those
I would
also
say this,
indicators, or?
yes, the signs are largely the same. Again, in the East, it hasn't been as developed as it has in the West. In the West, it's in many ways become almost like a science. The East tends to be less inclined to develop things like that. So it's a much more free-form type thing. It's not as developed. But what you see again in the writings over and over again is reaction in the presence of holy things, but also knowledge, especially if they have knowledge of events that have no knowledge of. If they have knowledge of things they should not know about, that's often seen as a major indicator. And knowledge of languages would be an example of that.
What about, issues with space? We would say that, some space is dedicated to the holy, and some space is sometimes dedicated to evil. And along with that dedication can come demonic activity in a particular place. So it's not associated with a person, but it's more associated with a particular location. Is there a similar understanding there in Eastern theology? And of course, what is done whenever there is a problem with unholy space, I should say?
Yeah, this is seen as a significant thing in the East. Yes, and that's why in the Eastern churches, there's a long tradition of house blessings occurring annually. In many Eastern Christian traditions, not in all, but in many, at the Feast of Theophany, when Jesus is baptized in the Jordan, holy water is blessed, and then very often the priest will go to the homes of the parishioners and bless the house with a special blessing. And one of the reasons why that's done every year, annually, year after year, is again to keep the house from becoming a place where evil takes root. Because there is the understanding that a place can be holy or a place can have a dark energy in its midst. And the goal is to prevent that from happening to a person's house. So yes, that's seen as being a reality. How do you deal with it? Well, prayer, holy water. But again, it's very often a thing that takes multiple tries. Exorcism, both in the East and the West, is rarely a one-time event. In the movies, it's like a showdown, right? The priest shows up, the person's held down, the head spins, the levitation takes place, and then boom, the person's freed. And it's like a showdown and it's over. In reality, it's something that occurs over and over again. Typically, exorcisms are more like therapy. You may have an exorcism a week over a period of a year, or every couple of weeks over several months before the person's fully liberated. So both in the East and the West, it's seen as more of a process rather than a one-time event.
I've always wondered about that, because in Scripture it's a one-time event, and the authority of Christ is pretty decisive there. So if exorcists are appealing to the authority of Christ and they're allegedly backed by his authority, why isn't it a one-time thing?
It can be in rare instances, but it typically isn't. And I think what it comes down to ultimately is that an exorcist of today, although they're acting with the authority of Christ, they are not Christ. The authority of Christ works through the church, but it's not always as evident and as immediately manifest as it is when Christ himself is present in performing the action.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to blessing space and things like that, one of the things that I've heard is that laity in the West can't bless particular objects. What do you say about the Eastern tradition? Could the laity bless particular things and liberate them from evil?
So there's a tradition in the East of lay persons performing certain blessings, but it's very limited, and it's typically things under their dominion or under their protection, so to speak. Like, a father can bless children, for example, things of that nature. But both in the East and the West, ultimately, the main blessings are reserved for priests. And in the West, deacons perform blessings as well. In the East, not so much. In the East, deacons typically are very limited in blessings. The blessings are primarily reserved for priests. But there are instances in which a non-priest can perform blessings. For example, a number of years ago, I visited a female monastery of female nuns, and the Mother Superior, she was able to perform blessings. This was actually a Catholic monastery of the Benedictine tradition. And, the Mother Superior was able to bless everybody there at night, right after night prayer. There are cases like that where a person can perform blessings who's not a priest. But again, it's very limited.
Yeah, that's interesting. Tell me some other things that we should know about the Eastern Catholic perspective on demonology.
Okay. So this all sounds pretty horrible, right? The whole experience of being tempted, of being enslaved in a passion, of possibly being possessed. But ultimately, this is seen as being something that God allows for our benefit, for our good. The demons are in no way, shape, or form remotely equal to God. They're extremely limited compared to the power of God. I mean, God created them, he made them, and he allows them to operate for a purpose. And that purpose is to allow us to grow in theosis. In other words, for us to fully reach our potential as beings, who sharing in the image and likeness, and ultimately in the divinity to a certain extent of God, divinization, theosis. For us to reach that full potential, we have to triumph over temptation. So the fact that the demons come and tempt us ultimately is seen as a positive thing, because it gives us opportunities to grow in holiness and grace. Without that temptation, we'd kind of be stuck at a certain place. It'd be hard for us to grow. It's kind of like this, weightlifting. I used to do weightlifting back when I had more time. I would show up and I would, pick up weights. At first, they're pretty light. And as the time went on, I lifted heavier and heavier weights. And eventually, I was able to be fairly strong and lift weights that I never imagined I could lift before. In many ways, facing and triumphing over temptations is like weightlifting. You overcome a few small ones, you become stronger and stronger spiritually. You overcome some major ones, you become very spiritually strong. On the other hand, if you just sit in a chair all day and you don't exercise, you don't lift anything, you barely even walk from room to room, your muscles will become weaker and weaker. Eventually, you have a hard time walking down the hallway because you're not using your muscles enough to exercise them. In the same way, if you're not facing temptations on a regular basis and experiencing some small triumphs, it becomes harder and harder to grow spiritually, and it becomes easier and easier to become spiritually stagnant. So as awful as all of this is, it serves a purpose. God allows it to happen for our benefit in the long run.
How could we become stronger and avoid some of these problems according to the Eastern tradition?
So the main thing is prayer and fasting. And fasting is a big thing. It's interesting. Our Western culture as a whole has lost the sense of fasting. And it's seen as a burden. It's seen as old-fashioned. It's seen as something that's pointless. And it's unfortunate that in many cases, Western Christianity has forgotten about fasting. There are exceptions, but I'd say it's much more widely ignored than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago. And fasting is seen as being a powerful means of growing spiritually. It's seen as being one of the fundamental things. As you may recall in the Gospels, Jesus talked about certain demons that can only be driven out through prayer and fasting. So fasting has spiritual power. So engaging in a life of fasting, engaging in a life of prayer, and a life of humility. Now, the Eastern Fathers would talk a lot about praying without ceasing, the Jesus prayer. In our tradition, we have the Jesus prayer. It goes like this: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. There are variations of it, but the idea is you say it over and over again until it becomes a part of you. And many of the Eastern fathers and Eastern saints talk about that prayer having the power to drive away the devil. The evil spirits hate the Jesus prayer. They flee when it's said. And if you get in the habit of praying it over and over again, oftentimes prayed with a rope like this one, if you get in the habit of praying it over and over again, it eventually becomes a part of you. And eventually it's carrying on its own without you even thinking about it. And if you get to that case where the prayer is always going, in a sense, you have like a natural repellent going that drives away the demonic. The demons hate that prayer. They hate being around anyone saying it. And if you're praying it all the time without ceasing, it's almost like having a fence erected around you that keeps the demonic away.
I don't exactly know why, but that has been my favorite prayer. I can't exactly pinpoint why, but I love the Jesus prayer. In fact, I think that would be an excellent show. And now that I mention it, there have been several patrons that have asked to do shows on the Jesus prayer and even its history and things like that.
I would love that. It's a favorite topic of mine.
I would think that would be really helpful because in the, of course, Western tradition, there's other prayers that are focused on one focuses on, and that's fine. That's great. But I think that sometimes the Eastern tradition gets overshadowed, and that's not necessarily good. So,
and the Jesus prayer is so powerful. And there have been times in my life where I've experienced evil. I've been in the presence of evil, both supernatural and natural evil. And during those instances, I went to the Jesus prayer, and it seemed to resolve the situation. It made the evil either go away or gave me the strength to get through the situation. That prayer has tremendous power.
So whenever you're going through a temptation, you're tempted to engage in some kind of sin, you would say a good prayer to go to immediately would be the Jesus prayer.
Absolutely. It's perhaps the best one.
And speaking of this, I imagine there are some people who are either watching this or going to watch it that are going to encounter the demonic explicitly. Maybe in a home that they go to, or maybe personally, something along those lines. I would imagine you would also recommend the Jesus prayer to them in those cases.
Absolutely. Yes. I've been in situations where I've seen, evil, and in those instances, the Jesus prayer got me through it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a good one. And of course, in the Western tradition, you often hear the Hail Mary, of course, in those cases. And I think that's fine. That's good. But I think that we should also consider some of the Eastern prayers, and the Jesus prayer is one of them. I think that is more exclusively Eastern in its history. I haven't really come across it a whole lot in the West.
Yes, that is true. It's primarily found in the East, but interestingly enough, I learned all about it from a Roman Catholic priest. When I was in college, I went to University of Pittsburgh, and I met a priest there who does campus ministry named Father David Abernathy. He's the head of the Oratorians. They're an order of, priests and brothers. He's the head of the oratory in Pittsburgh, and they do campus ministry at both Pitt and also at Carnegie Mellon University. And he's the one who introduced me to all of this. He got me into the Jesus prayer. He taught me the Philokalia. He gave me the Eastern spirituality that I knew nothing about. He taught it to me. And by the way, if you look him up online, Father David Abernathy, he has a ministry called Philokalia Ministries, and he makes podcasts and videos, and they're phenomenal. He knows more about Eastern spirituality than 99% of Eastern Christians. I've rarely met an Orthodox or Eastern Catholic priest who knows as much about it as he does. He taught me all of this, and it made all the difference in my life.
Yeah, I want to do an episode on that one, so we'll definitely need to continue it. Before we get to some of the chat questions, and by the way, y'all can go ahead and start to send them. Just make sure to send it to @Reason and Theology. But before we start to take chat questions, are there any other things that we should know, especially as I think probably most of the people who are watching this are Latin, Western Christians. So what are some of the things that we should know about the Eastern Catholic tradition when it comes to demonology?
Well, ultimately, the differences between East and West on this topic are not extreme, but there are differences in emphasis. There's a book that's really worth checking out called The Ladder of Divine Ascent, written by Saint John of the Ladder, also known as Saint John Climacus. And in that, he talks about the levels we go through in our ascension to becoming more and more like God. And along the way, demonic forces, demonic entities are trying to stop us. And he really goes into great detail as to how all this works and how you triumph through it. It's probably the very best book to read on the subject matter. Again, The Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. I highly recommend it. But it really lays out the basic understanding of how demons work in the process of temptation. I think that's the main place to look. And that, by the way, is an icon. There's an icon of the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Yeah. And it's a popular icon that kind of illustrates this. And I think it really encapsulates the Eastern perspective on this. Again, the biggest difference is one in emphasis. But I would say what it comes down to is in the Eastern churches, the demonic is primarily looked at through how it interacts with our mind, less so than how it interacts in the more sensational supernatural manifestations. In the Western tradition, there isn't, not always, but there isn't quite as much emphasis on how the demonic works on the mind as there is in the East. But there are numerous exceptions to that, of course. The other thing worth pointing out about this too is that in the Eastern tradition, the demonic is seen as being something that we battle against for a purpose. Again, I talked about the growth aspect, but very often this battle is seen as taking place in the desert, whether figuratively or literally. You find a lot of writings about the desert. And the reason for that is the desert is seen as a place where the spirits kind of reign. It's a place where the spirits run wild, so to speak. And many of the early Christians would go into the desert to do spiritual battle. They'd go there to grow in holiness, to grow closer to God, but they also saw it as a battlefield, a place where they could have, head-on spiritual battles with the evil ones. So you find a lot of emphasis upon the desert in the Eastern writings. And again, sometimes the desert is a cell in a monastery in a city. It's not always a literal desert. Interestingly enough, though, you see this same emphasis in the Carmelite tradition in the West. The Carmelite spiritual writers spend a lot of time talking about the desert and about the cell and the monk. And that's perhaps because the Carmelites as an order originated in Eastern monasticism. So there's a connection there that kind of carried over with the emphasis upon the desert.
Yeah, and Jesus talks about demons going to arid places and bringing seven more demons with it and things like that. So, but I've always wondered why the desert. What's this?
I think the reason why the desert is given such attention as the perfect analogy for all of this, or the perfect place for spiritual battle, is it's a place that's not controlled by humans. It's a place where human society, human civilization has very little influence. So, in the world that we live in, if the devil or a demon wants to get to us, they can get to us very easily through other people, through entertainment, through various means. In our modern society, that's especially true. If the evil one wants to harm us or get to us, he can influence us through a television show, through an ad on your telephone. He can get to you through something you hear on the radio, or somebody giving you suggestions as you talk to them during a conversation. When you go into the desert and you're away from human society, you're in a place where there's a wildness. And by wildness, I mean things can happen out of our control, out of our understanding. And the evil can't get to you in the same way. They can't influence you through the same means. So therefore, they attack you much more directly. They come at you with illusions. They come at you, with more supernatural manifestations, because that's how they reach you when you're away from human society. So that's one of the reasons why the desert plays this role. It's a place where it's a wild place away from civilization, away from the rules of humanity that we established, but it's also a place where evil can't come at you in the regular means, so it comes at you much more directly. That's why there are all these stories of monks, having visions of the devil in the desert, or being physically assaulted by evil spirits in the desert. In other places, like in Europe, for example, where there is no desert, the forest took the place of the desert as being the place outside of the rules of humanity, outside of our society, and a place where spirits come at you directly. That's the magical place where the spiritual danger exists. In European, in the writings, many of the Northern European saints in the East, the forest is the place of magic, not the desert.
It's a really good point. Side note, I don't know if you've heard of Father Lazarus. He's a Coptic monk at Mount Sinai. I don't know if he's
He's
still
awesome.
there. Yeah, I've seen some of his documentaries. I don't know if he's still there or around, but in that kind of an isolated environment, I've always wondered if he's ever had to face off with this kind of stuff.
He probably has. He probably has. I'm a big fan of his. I've watched so many videos and documentaries, interviews with him. And you can see when you watch those documentaries and those videos, the humility. He has tremendous humility. And you can also see the peace. He has tremendous peace. You never see him agitated. You never see him, trying to ferment disunity of any kind. And you never see him talking about how spiritually advanced he is. You see there the fruits of the Spirit. That's how you know he's legit.
Yeah, I've every time I watch, a video about him, I'm always inspired. So there's definitely something to be said there about him.
Yeah.
There's a couple questions here. What is Father Deacon's view about Harry Potter and Freemasonry in relationship to the demonic?
Okay, I'll do Freemasonry first. I'll be honest with you, I'm not an expert on it. Do I think that it's demonic inherently? I don't know. What I would say is there's a long history of Freemasonry being behind horrible events. Many atrocities in history were linked in some way to Freemasonry. That being said, today, are the Freemasons inherently demonic? In my experience, no. I'm not saying to join them. I'm not saying to endorse them, but I'm saying that in my limited experience, the Freemasons I've dealt with are typically civic-minded individuals who come together to engage in civic activities. They come together and they perform strange rituals, oftentimes full of various symbolism. But is it inherently demonic? I don't know. My instinct is it's not. That being said, I would not be involved with it. But regarding Harry Potter, I'm a fan. I love Harry Potter. But I think you need to approach it in the right way. If you approach it as fantasy, which is what J.K. Rowling intends, she intends it to be approached as fantasy, the magic in it serves much the same purpose as, say, the magic of Gandalf in Lord of the Rings or the Wizard of Oz. The magic is there as a device to enable the exploration of possibilities that you can't find in the real world. I don't think there's anything inherently spiritually dangerous about Harry Potter. The only possible danger is if a young person reads it and begins to think it's real, in the sense that they believe that there is, magic and witchcraft that's accessible to them. They begin studying the occult or delving into the occult. I could see that as being potentially dangerous. My daughter knows Harry Potter inside and out. She has all the books. She's read them inside and out. She knows the movies by heart. She knows that it's not real. She knows it's fantasy, and she knows it's no different than the magic of Gandalf. It's not real either. But if somebody is reading this stuff and they don't have the proper guidance in their lives, and they go to an occult bookstore and start buying spell books, that could be a bad thing. But again, you have to look at it for what it is, which is fantasy literature, not reality.
Here's one. What do the Byzantine Catholic churches say about demons' roles in the particular judgment, a la toll houses, if anything?
Right. So for those who aren't familiar with it, there's a certain strand of tradition in the East where people talk about this idea of toll houses, that when you die, you go through a series of temptations where demons basically try and tempt you You have to pass each one stage after stage before you can enter into the heavenly realm, enter into the presence of God. This is not church teaching. It was never church teaching, and it was never widely accepted in the East as being true. From what I can gather, this whole idea of toll houses began as a metaphor or as an allegory to try and illustrate what St. John Climacus talks about in the Ladder of Divine Ascent. It was kind of like a creative way of illustrating what it talks about in that book. And somewhere along the line, people start to think that it might be true. So you find various writers who believe that the toll houses are real. A writer who I love and greatly admire, Father Seraphim Rose, came to believe that toll houses were real. I disagree with him on that. I think they're nothing more than an illustration or an allegory to try and make sense on a greater level of what St. John Climacus is talking about. But in general, no one in the Eastern Catholic tradition especially necessarily believes that toll houses are literal. They see them as more metaphorical.
Melanie asks, are there any particular saints that suffered from intrusive thoughts, blasphemous in nature specifically? Any advice for dealing with these thoughts which occur daily?
There are a number of saints who had these type of experiences. I can't name any off the top of my head, but I've read many stories like this. When a person's dealing with those kind of thoughts, they say the first thing to do is find a wise elder to talk to, a spiritual father, a starets, somebody, usually a monk, who has insight into this that you can talk about this with and work through this with. Because they'd say in situations like this, you would need somebody with experience to help you get through it.
Are there Eastern Catholic starets that are available for things like that?
Yes, but not a whole lot in this country. In other parts of the world, it might be a lot easier to find some. In the United States and in North America, there are a number of Eastern Catholic monasteries, but not enough. And that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy because in the Eastern Christian world, monasteries are spiritual batteries. And ideally, every diocese has a monastery, sometimes several. And people go to the monasteries to get spiritually renewed. Everyone goes there for wisdom and guidance. You want monasteries because they enable you to have a strong spiritual presence in your community. In North America, that never took off. And that's largely because of what's called Latinization. This is when Eastern churches, Eastern Catholic churches specifically, would begin to adopt Western Latin mindsets, Western Latin practices. Again, nothing wrong with Western Latin practices. They're awesome. They're awesome. But when you import them over to the East, oftentimes it doesn't work because you've taken the part out of its whole. Here's an example. Think you have two different vehicles. You have a Ford Mustang, and then you might have a Hummer, right? You might take the part out of the Hummer and put it in the Ford Mustang, and it might get you down the street, but it won't work as well. That's what happens when you import things from the West and try and shove them into the East without them fitting in organically. So one thing that happened in the East, especially in North America, was we kind of lost monasteries for a period of time and adopted the Western model of religious orders that are primarily active. And that was a loss. That was a loss. So rather than having, monasteries with monks where we could go and pray and grow spiritually, we'd have Western style religious orders who are out in the community doing active things without the same type of spiritual influence that a monastery would have. And there's been a real effort to recapture Eastern Catholic monasticism in this country. And there's been a lot of progress made. There are some fantastic Eastern Catholic monasteries today, but not as many as there should be, not nearly enough.
Ellie is asking, do demons react more to different holy languages than others? In other words, react more to Latin than English?
I don't believe that's the case. Now, there are people who disagree with me, but my understanding of it is the language, it's the meaning of the words, not the language that's used, that has the impact. That's my understanding.
Somebody's asking, what is the best resource to read on the Jesus Prayer?
So a great place to begin is a classic book called The Way of a Pilgrim. It's written by an anonymous Russian pilgrim. By pilgrim, I mean somebody who travels from place to place seeking out spiritual wisdom. This book, The Way of the Pilgrim, is kind of the classic text on the Jesus prayer. It's fantastic. It's a story. It's a true story, but it's riveting and it's instructive. If you get a chance, look it up. It's called The Way of a Pilgrim. Another very good book from the Eastern tradition is called The Mountain of Silence. It's a more recent book. I forget the name of the author, but it deals with Eastern Christian spirituality. It also goes into a lot of detail about this and is very helpful as well.
The Way of a Pilgrim. Yeah, that I'm looking at it right now. That looks good. I have not
It's
read
fantastic.
that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, definitely going to get that. Like I said, I want to have you back on to do the Jesus prayer. So
I would love that.
Maybe in a month or less, I think we need
Sure.
to go ahead and do that. Any final concluding points that you wanted to bring out that we haven't touched on before we
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I'll be honest with you. I'm not very comfortable talking about the subject too much because I don't like drawing attention to the demonic. We have to be aware of it, but at the same time, we don't want to give too much attention and credit to it. It's a balancing act. But one thing that the demonic loves, one thing the demons love is to be worshipped. They want to be worshipped as gods. And that can take many different forms in many different cultures. Many of the Eastern fathers talk about some of the gods of the past actually being demons in disguise, especially the gods who demanded human sacrifices. You find them talking about Molech being a demon, for example. He was a Canaanite god who demanded the sacrifice of infants. So there's this understanding that demons want worship. And the way that the fathers talk about it is these are fallen angels. And, angels, in a sense, are beings of light. But when an angel falls, their light begins to fade. And in many cases, their light fades and fades and fades to the point that they're barely there, so to speak. But when humans begin to worship them and give them what they want, they grow stronger. Now, how that works, nobody really explains. How that works, nobody really elaborates on it. But apparently, the worship given them feeds them in a sense. It makes them stronger and gives them more energy. Again, there's no doctrine on this. This is just stuff I've kind of gleaned here and there. But I find that pretty fascinating. And I think in our culture today, demons are worshipped, but oftentimes in ways that aren't obvious. Perhaps it's the worship of certain material things, or the worship of certain actions, in a sense, can be a form of demonic worship. But I think it's intriguing that a lot of the most notorious, demonic actors in history demanded the sacrifice of children. That's what they seem to want more than anything. In Carthage, for example, they had a whole culture built around child sacrifice. You found the same thing in parts of South America. And today, a woman's right to choose, as it's called, has become an object of worship in a sense. Some people hold it up as being the most inalienable and most important fundamental of all rights. And I can't help but wonder if there's demonic influence behind that. And if what's going on with the mass slaughter of innocents through abortion is in some way feeding the demons in a way we don't quite understand. I can't help but wonder about that.
Yeah, I've thought about that and definitely heard some disturbing connections there. So, but like I said, I look forward to doing the Jesus prayer on the next one. So that's going to be awesome.
It would be fantastic. I love talking about that.
And everybody, thank y'all for watching. I really appreciate y'all's comments and interactions there. And of course, Father, thank you for coming on and doing this. Everybody, don't forget, of course, to subscribe, share this on your social media, and also check us out, as I always say, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. That's where you can go to support what we're doing here so we can continue to offer this content to you. And also you'll get access to extra content. I just posted a new video there yesterday. So definitely go and check it out. It's the address scrolling at the bottom of your screen. All right. Until next time. God bless.
Have you ever used a business service just to find out later that they publicly promote views contrary to God's law? If so, then check out StAnthonyServices.org, where you'll find a Catholic vendor in your area that will offer top quality services. Simply go to the website and share some basic information with St. Anthony Services, or call 1-877-LIFE-US1. What are you waiting for? Check out StAnthonyServices.org and support your fellow Catholic professionals today. And tell them R&T sent you.